Welcome to the Business Building Blocks podcast, where we talk about the struggles and celebrations that leaders and entrepreneurs experience on their journey to success. I'm your host, Kristina, and I'm passionate about helping you achieve massive amounts of success at work and at home. We'll talk about all things people and organizational wellness, share relatable stories, and feature insightful guests because quality people and processes are at the heart of every success story. Ready to learn, grow, and have fun? Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Business Building Blocks podcast. I'm your host, Kristina Schmidt. It is, as I'm recording this, November 11th. So that is Remembrance Day here in Canada, Veterans Day over in the US. And so I'll start with saying thank you to all of our veterans. Thank you to everybody who's served in any kind of the military services. We thank you. You have done tremendous work, tremendous sacrifice for our freedoms. So thank you for that. It is also, speaking of freedom, it's 1 week almost past the US election. So as many of you know, I am a US citizen. I live in Canada. So I kind of get to hang out in both political environments. So it's been an interesting, we'll say, election season. And in this less than a week's time, I have found myself wanting to give advice to many people that I've been giving to my 5-year-old lately. So I'll tell you about what Ryan, my 5-year-old, has been doing. He's got a lot of emotions, a lot of big thoughts, big feelings. So when he gets angry, he gets really angry, and his first go-to is, I hate you. And I'm like, hey, bud, just because you don't agree with me or you don't like what I've said doesn't mean you hate me. Or just because someone took something from you doesn't mean you hate them. You're still friends. You're just not happy with them right then, or you just don't like the thing they said. Which brings me to the elections. There are many people blasting through social media or whatever and literally like unfriending people or unfollowing certain service providers, even like influencers and that kind of thing because of political views. So I just want to talk about conflict. Conflict is, well, first I want you to pause. How does conflict feel to you? So when I say these words, when I've just been telling those stories, how does that feel inside? Are you anxious? Are you like going, oh, that sometimes is my feeling. I'll be honest. But how does it really feel? And then I just want you to think, what's the purpose of conflict? Is it a good thing? Or is it a bad thing and something to be avoided? When you really look at it, conflict done respectfully, sometimes even disrespectfully, but conflict is the only way that things will change. We only have the United States of America and really even Canada because there was some conflict, right? People didn't like what was happening and they came over and they eventually established a whole new country. So there is conflict there, but things don't get invented. Like we probably wouldn't have cell phones unless there was some kind of a conflict or a need that had to happen to have a cell phone. And now most of us are addicted to them and we can't get away from them, which is another source of conflict. But we need conflict. We especially need conflict in our workplace because we don't want people just going, yes, yes, and agreeing. And if you do, you don't enjoy my podcast anyway. So I'm assuming that everybody who's actually listening to this likes conflict, sees the need of it, or they want people to be empowered to contribute to their team. And they want them to be innovative. They want them to be successful. So I'm assuming that's why you're listening to this podcast. So with that, we need conflict, but we need to learn to do it well. And so I have a couple of just simple ground rules to start you out on this journey. Again, it is November 11th. So if you're in the US, you're going to have family holidays coming up. So you've got Thanksgiving, our Thanksgiving number 2 for me. So Thanksgiving, you'll have Christmas, and you might have extended time with people that you don't see often. So lots of potential conflict coming at work and at home. So I'm just going to give some simple ground rules. I've had other podcast episodes where I've talked about a whole stretch, a process for doing it. But overall, like, we just need to support conflict. So there are just some ground rules that, and maybe mindset shifts that will help. So let's go through those. So my first one is very much related to the advice I've been giving my 5-year-old. It is, disagreeing does not mean that you hate the person. I know it sounds so simplistic, but there are so many times when it's like people start to disagree. And I remember this as a leader. I would be in a meeting and people would be disagreeing. And I was always like, I knew I needed them to have this conversation. Sometimes the conversation would get nasty though, right? And so at some point you have to stop that. You need to bring it all back in and like bring it back to good, right? So you need to kind of be, as a leader, you need to be watching what's happening. But overall, you want these ideas to be sussed out. You can step in to keep it clean, right? No hitting below the belt, all that kind of stuff, and facilitate a more productive conversation. Because when people start, calling names or accusing things that are maybe just an idea that they have, that's not going to lead to a healthy conflict. So just keeping in mind that disagreement is a good thing. And the fact is that when we start bringing these different ideas out, even if they're not really contentious ideas, but when we start bringing them up and saying, hey, can we have a chat about this? I feel this way, but it seems you have the opposite. Can we have a chat? Right? When we start talking through those things, we might find that our relationships will grow stronger because now we're having a deeper understanding of people. It's not just what's in our brains, because our brains are pretty miraculous little things. Have you ever done those, like read those things where they've scrambled up all of the words in the paragraph, but they've left the first and the last letter intact? You can read it almost as easily as if it's all written properly, but our brains are able to connect dots. In a similar way, when we're working with people, we're talking with people, and we don't maybe get all of the conversation or all of the social cues that we might need. So like texting, for example, or emailing, we see only the words. So we don't have the intonation, we don't have the inflection, we don't have the pauses in the right places, we don't see facial expressions, hand gestures. If you're listening to this just audio, you're not seeing me get all excited and animated with my with my hands, because I get super excited and pumped about this sort of thing. But you're not seeing that. So maybe you're missing some of the energy. But our brains are able to fill in the blank. But they're not always accurate. They're going to fill in the blank based on our own histories and our own experiences and our own belief systems, which are not going to be the same as anyone else's. No one else, even a sibling, even maybe a twin, they are not going to have the same life experience, thought beliefs, thought patterns that we have. So we have to talk about it. So this is, I'm just reinstituting that, or restating that conflict is so critical, but remembering that as a ground rule, it's okay to disagree. We can be very good friends with people we disagree with on certain things, and that's all right. And if we talk about it, we have spirited discussions, that's okay. Sometimes that makes it fun. Have you ever left a conversation where you're like, man, that was a really fun argument, right? And it's not malicious. You've just really sussed out some opinions and maybe gained a deeper understanding, or maybe you've thought through your thought process even more. So keeping that in mind, that's my rule number 1. But it leads me to rule number 2, and I've talked about this one before. So I got this concept actually from a book called Good Inside by Dr. Becky Kennedy. It's actually a parenting book. So if you have not read it and you want a different take on leadership, I highly recommend reading this book, because when I read it, I probably could have rewritten the whole thing with how you would deal with your team, because it is so, like, people are people, whether they're tiny humans or big grown-up humans, right? And as my colleague Melanie Taylor, who has written the Thrive program that I do, we are all children dressed up in our adult costumes, right? So we are still at heart children. So taking parenting advice and applying it to your leadership, very helpful. So anyway, this advice came from a parenting thing. But our goal in a conflict, or our goal in any kind of a misunderstanding, needs to not be to convince the other person that our idea is correct. That's not the goal. The first goal needs to be to understand their perspective. So think about that for just a second. Think about how you might come into a conversation where you're just trying to get understanding, not trying to say, my idea is correct, you need to think it too. How would you approach that differently? You would ask questions. You might have empathy, which I've talked about. I had a whole series about trust and empathy, right? So you might have empathy already. You might be so curious that you're like, wow, I never thought about it like that. And then you come away with, maybe you haven't changed your mind and they haven't changed their mind, but you can be empathetic to that side of it, because it's like, you know what, I can see it from that perspective. I'm not so close-minded that I'm going to say, no, that's not correct because it's not my idea, or no, it's not correct because it doesn't follow this belief system that I have. I'm going to say that, well, I can see your perspective. Yep, it follows some logic. We just have some core beliefs that are different. And then it's up to you to decide if that's okay or not. Going back to rule number 1, right? Are you okay to have those different core beliefs? So I'm going to get into that part in just a few minutes. So that's my rule number 2. So remembering the goal of the conversation is to understand the other perspective, not to convince them of their idea. And the third rule, the third ground rule, is trust, right? Again, I've had a whole podcast about trust. So establishing trust and reestablishing and growing and building that trust inside and outside of these conversations, these conflict feeling conversations, that is critical to making these productive. Because when we trust somebody, we know they're not undermining us, and we know they're not out to get us or out to hurt us or to make us look stupid or any of those things. And that's the key to having these healthy conflicts. So on your team, you should be developing trust between peers. And I'm not saying you have to go do trust falls and all of that stuff, but you need them to have the conflict, have a reasonable argument or disagreement about it, and then come away with knowing the relationship can still be intact. And this is just a base level thing. So if you read 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, he lays out this pyramid of how to have good conflict, essentially. And the base of it is trust. We have to have trust. And this is like the base of every relationship. So when we think through trust, it's helpful to think through it in different sections, because sometimes we just have like a gut feel, like there's just don't trust this person. So I've had this with somebody in my team where it's like they're telling me things and I like the person. There's, I know they know what they're doing, but sometimes they tell me something and it's like, why don't I believe them? And there's different ways to look at trust. So the first and kind of basic one is like, well, are they doing what they said they're going to do? Right? So if you're looking to build trust with someone, only commit to things that you're going to actually do, because not doing them is actually going to set you 2 steps back, right? So do the things you said you were going to do, because that builds trust. It's number 1, right? Second thing, you've got to look at, okay, well, do they know what they're talking about in this situation? So, maybe taking all the political things, there have been untruths from both sides, from the media, from political commercials, because they don't have to be true, but there's a lot of questionable things that are out there and things that are just blatantly not true. So when people are starting to argue sides of these things, it's like, well, do they even know what the fact is? Or are they going off of maybe these fear mongering things or these ideas or what so and so told them, but no one's actually read the thing or read the law or read the bill or read whatever it is. So they're not actually knowledgeable. So understanding that and saying, well, what you're saying, maybe I don't trust that part of what you're saying. And sometimes that can kind of solve the argument in your brain, because as leaders, being humble is sometimes is a very critical virtue to have. And sometimes just saying, okay, well, I can see how you might think that. I disagree, but you know what? I respect that you think that way. And just knowing that, I'm not saying like agree to disagree necessarily, but understanding that maybe their perspective is tainted a bit, or maybe they don't have all the truths, and maybe we don't have to trust that, and we don't have to really entertain that argument either. So it's a little bit off track on that one. So trust will come into like, are people doing what they say they're going to do? Do we trust that they know what they're talking about? So it's kind of like a credibility sort of thing. Do we trust that they understand us? So this, leaning back into that rule number 2, have they tried to understand our perspective as well? So there's trust in that. And then like there's that integrity piece. Do we trust them as a human to do the right thing? Because again, going back to these misunderstood beliefs, they may have wonderful integrity. They're missing a piece, or they didn't see this one thing, or they've been lied to by people that should be trustworthy and we should be getting truth from. So there's a lot of pieces to trust. So it's important to try to, I'm going to say it's helpful to try to see where the trust has broken down in order to grow it. Now, again, holidays coming up. You may have a family member that you haven't seen in a long time, and you haven't seen them for a long time because your relationship is not good, right? So when we talk this trust end of things, we have to trust that they're going to treat us with respect as well. And if we can't trust that, now we have to put a boundary in place. And so to clarify boundaries, this is not a boundary episode. This probably be an entirely separate episode about boundaries. But quick lesson on boundaries is that a boundary is not trying to control anybody else. It's literally just controlling what we do. So a boundary would be, I can't speak to you when you talk like this, or I'm not going to have these conversations with you if you continue to yell. So you're not saying, don't yell at me. You're just saying, well, if you're going to yell, I'm going to exit. So when we're having these kind of trust building thing, or we're trying to build trust, I guess, outside of the relationship, being aware of our boundaries and giving them an opportunity to change and grow, that can build trust too, right? If like maybe you've laid that boundary out and they said, wow, I've never realized that I've yelled. And so thank you for letting me know. Not everyone is going to react that way to things, but that can actually grow the relationship versus just engaging in the argument, yelling back, or just never talking to them again. So there are a lot of things you can do with boundaries. And so kind of bringing all of it together and back to the boundary thing, there will be times when maybe when you're going back to like that rule number 1, where, there could be a base value that is disagreeing or that you disagree with, where it's actually imposing on you, right? And like that's kind of a boundary. So another way to think about boundaries is how much access do we allow people to have to us, and how much ability do they have to impact our mood, maybe is not the right way to say it, but our system. So if you're having a discussion and you find that there's a core base belief that you disagree with, but it never really, like, it makes you understand their perspective, but they're not forcing you to change your perspective or to change your core belief, then like they're not in that part of it, right? So it's like we have a fence with our boundary and they're not trying to enter that fence. So it's okay. It's okay to be there. It's like you can still be friends with them. You can still work at the same place. You can still have family parties with them or hang out with them as a friend, and that's fine. But it's if someone's trying to force into your fenced area, or maybe you've opened the fenced area for them and they're in there and they're kind of making you be affected by that, then you have to look at, okay, do I need to reestablish a boundary here? Do I need a really big boundary because they're not going to follow any boundaries I set? So there becomes a point when you have to make decisions around how far you let them go, right, with the conflict, because the conflict is now maybe not respectful anymore. Okay, so too big of a tangent on boundaries there, but just a quick lesson. I think I'm going to I'll put one together. I'll put an episode together on that in the next month or so. But when we're having these conflict discussions, it's important to think that and to remember they're important to have. We want to keep them clean, right? No hitting below the belt, but we need to have that honesty. We need to have that ability to say what it is we believe. We don't need a lot of expletives around it. We shouldn't be calling names or like that kind of like, it shouldn't be dirty, but it needs to be honest. Like I've seen conflict go really bad in the passive aggressive side where it's like, you're thinking all these things like, I don't like how you do this. I don't like how I feel when you approach me this way. I don't agree with how we're approaching this problem. Like there's real life things that need to be dealt with. But instead of saying that, they're saying, well, what do you think about that? And well, I don't really like it, but and so we get into this passive mode. Now conflict doesn't get resolved. It doesn't get solved. And we're stuck in a place where we don't want to be and we shouldn't be. So it's important when we're having our conflict to follow these kind of rules and then making sure that we're being truthful, being honest, but keeping it above the belt. Okay, so if you found today's episode helpful, please share it with a friend, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel, leave a comment, and leave a review, because this is how we get more word out to people, especially as we're having a lot of conflict now in the world. Again, we're coming into our holiday seasons, so there's maybe a little bit increased conflict there. So share this episode with some people, maybe establish some ground rules, or keep those ground rules in your brain as you're going and approaching these events and these situations, and bring it to your team, because that is really, really where it's going to be the most productive. Because when we have healthy conflict, now we're innovative. Now we're solving problems and we're getting to the root of things, and we're actually making sure we have the best resolution, not just the one that we all just, one who spoke the loudest or is the most offended when they're told no, right? So share this with a friend, subscribe, leave a review, comment back. How is this working for you? What do you think of these rules? Are they working for you? And if you would like to bring this into your team, to bring some healthy conversation, some healthy conflict, and really learn how to embrace it, then reach out to me. You can reach out on my website, just KristinaSchmidt.ca. Reach out, book a call with me, and let's have a chat. Let's talk about like what's on your team, what's going on. How can I help? Because we've got oodles of training programs. We've got Thrive, which is a big 6-month program we can bring in-house. We've got difficult discussions. So it's a process. It talks about our mindset and the process for having these healthy discussions. So if you would like any of that, then reach out, book a call with me. I would love to chat to see how I can help. And I will see you all next time on the next episode of the Business Building Blocks podcast.
Thanks for tuning in to the Business Building Blocks podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. If you found value in our conversation, please leave a quick review, like, or share. It helps us reach more amazing listeners like you. For more resources and insights, visit KristinaSchmidt.ca, where you can find tools and support to empower your leadership journey. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.